Unlike most platforming games at that time, Chakan had a very gothic vibe to it. The environments were very creepy and mimicked the comic book very well. For the most part, the levels are devoid of any type of real color, giving the game a very boring, bland presentation. My favorite world had to be the murky waters of the water domain. I'm also pretty fond of the volcanic stages too. Most of the enemies and characters are very well detailed and very close to their comic book counterparts. In fact, Forever Man pulls off the feeling of bringing Chakan's drawn world to life in a very sinister way, making the visuals for this game a tribute to his creation. The music does an exceptional job of depicting a hopeless, morbid, torturous, dead, and creepy atmosphere, which is actually one of the game's biggest strengths if you think about it. Almost every world does a splendid job of standing out from the rest of the worlds. This is one Sega game that terrible sound chip actually made the game sound pretty good. I liked how each track pulled me into this decayed world. The sound effects are great too, and I enjoyed the demonic moan Chakan uses when he gets hurt, and the sound of the enemies dying is very eerie too. I personally felt that both the music and sound set the atmosphere very nicely. However, not all the music is great. I for one did not like the elemental planes of evil. None of the songs from the earth, water, sky, or fire were catchy at all. I guess the composer was like, I don't think anyone will even get this far, so I guess I'll just throw a few chords together and that's it. This is another game that my friend Luke Knights owned way back in the day. In fact, he told me he bought this game just because of the cover, and I wouldn't blame him. That box art is pretty epic. The stage I remember the most is the volcanic stage. I'm pretty sure Knights and myself couldn't get past this stage when we were little, but it didn't keep us from trying. Even though this game was painstakingly difficult, it didn't deter our awesome sleepovers. In fact, around the same time he got this game, I bought Turtles in Time for the Super Nintendo, so Chakan actually took a back seat to Turtles in Time, which was an awesome game. But occasionally we would pick up Chakan again, but it was a very, very rough experience. Throughout the summer of 92, we would still try to beat Forever Man, and eventually by August of 92, we gave up and played better games like Street Fighter II on the Super Nintendo, and later that month, Super Mario Kart. Ah, memories. Luke told me that he still played Chakan off and on after I moved away in 96, but he never beat it. I bumped into Chakan after I bought a Genesis from a pawn shop in Rockford, Illinois, sometime around 2002. Chakan was one of the carts I got a huge bargain for. Yeah, no wonder. Anyway, I went home and played a lot of this game, and a lot of memories from when I was younger just came flooding back to me. It was great. In 2009, I finally beat this game, and it gave me a new memory, one that will stick with me the rest of my life. But I'll talk about that soon enough. Chakan the Forever Man is based after the late 1980s comic book series of the same name, created by R.A.K. The idea for the game came when Sega developer Ed Anazuda, I know that's off but I don't care, met with Robert at a comic book convention in the early 90s. Ed was fascinated by the character and thought he would meld very well with the Genesis' audience. On June 8th, 1992, Chakan the Forever Man released for the Sega Genesis, immediately being loathed by the critics and gamers from all over the US. People were crying over how hard this game was, and Chakan's shot for any sequel was dashed. Although, miraculously, Chakan did receive a Game Gear port, but it was a watered-down version of the Genesis game, and not very good. Years went by and Forever Man faded into obscurity. After Ed's studio, and now Games, had gone on to create great games like Echo the Dolphin and Kularbi, a sequel was drawn up for Sega's next system, the Dreamcast. This game would have Chakan traveling the galaxy and fighting new evils. The game also would allow Chakan to block too, which I was really looking forward to. By 2001, Ed now decided to release the game for all systems at that time, PS2 and even GameCube. However, the industry wasn't very kind to Chakan's sequel idea. Ed told publishers that the goal of the game was not to spend a lot of money on the game as a whole, but rather the first few levels. Wow. Ed boasted that only 5% of gamers would be able to actually beat the game, but the other 95% would see how great the first few worlds of the game looked. Needless to say, the publishers didn't go for this idea because games that are very hard didn't sell anymore. It was a newer marketing approach, and harder games couldn't compete with the dumbed-down difficulty present in GameCube and PS2 games at that time. Eventually, the game was killed off. Still, Ed had some very interesting ideas for Chakan's sequel. For the most part, he wanted to do a complete revamp of the swordplay. For one, he said players couldn't go around hacking and slashing the enemies to death. In fact, he wanted players to hunt the monsters, watch it, and then find a way to slay it. Very similar to Dreamcast's impressive learning AI system, which would have been awesome if you think about it. He said the gameplay would get better later in the game to reward the players who have actually completed the first few levels, which is impossible, by the way. A total of 12 worlds were planned and 6 worlds had been completed. However, once the Dreamcast went under, so did Chakan's survival. Although his gameplay mechanics, storyline, powers, and more would live on in Blood Omen 2 for the PS2. In fact, even some of the original world designs made it into the final game, shattering any hope of a Chakan revival. Keep in mind, this is more of a mini walkthrough of sorts than actual tips. At the beginning of the game, you first want to collect the 4 additional weapons. When fighting the bosses, I found it easiest to enchant your swords. This makes the boss fights go much smoother. Plus, look how cool Chakan looks with powered up swords. All you need to do is hang back and blast away. For the more challenging levels, I would recommend using the height spell. Being able to super jump causes less migraines, and trust me, this game will give you a lot of heartache. Now, the biggest trick of the trade I can pass on to you guys is the unlimited potions and the level skip cheats. However, keep in mind, performing these cheats does not make the game any less challenging. This game is by far one of the hardest games in history, and I'm not lying. But this cheat smooths out most of the wrinkles, and will give you a 50% chance of actually beating this game, with the bad ending. Immediately after turning on the game, hold C and start on both controllers. You should hear a sound. Now bring up the alchemy screen and press the gamepad for the weapons, and then press the buttons on the second controller for all the potions you'll ever need. There you are! Now on to mastering Chakan. Good luck, folks! Because the game is so impossible to begin with, my first complaint is Chakan can't block. You heard me right, no blocking at all. Now your argument may be, well come on K-Wing, this is an older game, cut it some slack and show some respect, meh meh meh. Well, my reply to you guys is Revenge of Shinobi is an older game and he could still block. The developers had no excuse for this game, and had it been able to block, this game would have been way better. The enemies and bosses are dumber than bricks in this game too, and most of the time they will kill themselves by just walking into your drawn blades. I still couldn't believe how funny this was. No matter what type of enemy they were, they will boldly step into your swords and kill themselves. Oh, come on. Even the bosses will do it. That's sad. The game's difficulty is a humongous factor. The stages themselves are almost impossible to beat, while the boss fights are walk in the park. Anyway, as you manage to beat the first plane of reality, then you're granted access to the elemental planes of evil. Guess what, gamers? These stages are 40% harder than the beginner stages you just barely managed to beat. Talk about mean. The reason these worlds are evil is because of all the endless enemies and constant platforming elements. Plus, the stages are much bigger. Good thing you're immortal, otherwise 90% of you would be getting game overs and having to start all the way at the beginning. I probably died in the lava world about 30 or 40 times just trying to jump from one floating rock to the next. The Ice Realm was the same deal. Even so, the Air Realm reality annoyed the crap out of me, especially riding those giant insects. If you ran out of magic, then this stage would get on your nerves enormously.